They drag her out of a luxury mall like a criminal, her designer baby bag in hand, eyes of strangers glued to her every step, whispers cutting through the air like blades. Not because she stole, not because she screamed, but because her skin was black, her silence was dignified, and her presence made them uncomfortable. Security swarmed, employees pointed, someone even laughed. They didn't care who she was. They saw a black woman in a high-end space and decided she didn't belong. No warning, no questions, just judgment. But what none of them knew, what would turn their world inside out, was that they hadn't humiliated a stranger. They had just lit a match under the very empire that built their prestige. And when it burned, it would burn from the inside. This isn't just a story about racism. This is what happens when arrogance collides with consequence. Hit like if you're ready for the truth. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a comment. What would you have done in her place? And where in the world are you watching from? Stay sharp. Nothing is what it looks like. The revolving doors of Ashfield Galleria rotated slowly as Layla Foster stepped into the main atrium of the most expensive shopping complex in the city. The air smelled of polished brass, imported leather, and the faintest trace of vanilla pumped discreetly through the vents to impress the wealthiest clientele. Marble floors stretched ahead like a runway, shining under the glow of crystal chandeliers. She walked with the kind of grace that came from experience, not performance. Her outfit was subtle yet immaculate, a light cashmere trench over a tailored navy blouse and ivory pants. No logos, no excess. The only thing that stood out was the leather baby bag draped over her shoulder, which, although elegantly designed, seemed to trigger something in the eyes of the man standing near the scanner gate. The security guard wore a crisp black uniform and a badge that read Jensen. He moved forward with purpose, blocking her gently but unmistakably. He didn't smile, didn't greet her. Instead, he asked if she could open her bag for inspection. His tone was rehearsed, the kind that pretends to be protocol but never hides the instinct behind it. Layla blinked once, neither surprised nor offended, simply accustomed. She calmly unclipped the bag and handed it over. Jensen put on a pair of thin gloves and began pulling out items one by one. A packet of baby wipes, a change of clothes in a zip pouch, a collapsible bottle warmer, 2 sealed jars of baby food, a soft toy clipped to the inside pocket. Everything was arranged neatly, clean, untouched. His fingers hovered a moment longer than necessary over the bottle warmer before he replaced it. Behind them, shoppers passed without interference, couples in wool coats, women in Pilates gear carrying designer totes, 2 teens with shopping bags from 3 different stores. None of them were stopped. A second guard, standing beside a nearby column, tapped the radio on his shoulder and murmured into the mic possible concealment scenario. He said, "Premium leather bag. Visual shows coordinated behavior. Recommend ongoing surveillance." Layla didn't flinch. She turned her head just enough to meet the second guard's eyes before he looked away. She had seen this routine before. Not loud, not aggressive, just quiet pressure applied through suspicion, one layer at a time. Jensen handed the bag back and nodded curtly. "All clear, ma'am." Layla nodded once in return, thanked him softly, and moved forward. Her destination was on the second floor, a minimalist baby boutique that sold wooden cribs with Scandinavian names and diaper bags that cost as much as rent. She entered the shop and approached the counter, where a young woman with sleek hair and a name tag smiled too wide and too tight. Layla stated her name and order reference. The woman nodded, stepped into the back room, and returned moments later with a gift-wrapped box. Layla accepted it, offered another quiet thank you, and left. As she stepped back into the corridor, the marble felt colder. She moved past storefronts without pausing. Inside the skincare boutique, 2 women paused mid-conversation to glance her way. One of them murmured something and tilted her chin toward Layla's bag. Layla kept walking. At the cafe corner near the escalator, an older man in a cashmere coat scowled as she passed, as if she had interrupted his view. The luxury corridor opened into the central plaza, where the sun streamed through a domed glass ceiling. She paused and checked her phone. Her assistant had sent confirmation of a final distribution deal. a multi-brand partnership worth 8 figures. Layla responded briefly and turned toward the escalator. As she moved, a concierge in a red blazer walked directly into her path and asked with practiced politeness whether she needed assistance. Layla replied no, just browsing, but the woman lingered half a second too long before offering a smile and turning away. Layla didn't miss the discreet glance she exchanged with another uniformed figure at the information desk. She made her way to the in-house cafe and took a seat by the window. The server came slowly. The menu was presented without comment. Her drink, when it arrived, was lukewarm and set down with no coaster, no sugar. She didn't react. She simply stirred, sipped, and watched. Across the plaza, one of the guards from earlier now stood near a planter, his eyes fixed in her direction while pretending to scan the crowd. The second had moved to the second-floor balcony, from where he looked down casually, arms crossed, radio on his shoulder now silent. Layla's phone buzzed. Another confirmation from legal. The licensing paperwork for the European rollout was complete. Her signature would greenlight the campaign across 7 countries. Her name was on the contract. Her company, Layfina, would be leading the charge. That level held the executive lounge for private clients, spaces designed for curated purchases, exclusive previews, and clients deemed important enough to shop behind tinted glass and velvet ropes. She didn't go there often, not because she didn't belong, but because she hated what happened every time she did. Today, however, she had a meeting scheduled with a brand rep regarding a new product collaboration. It was a quiet step in a bigger picture, and she intended to walk it with precision. As the elevator doors opened and she stepped out, the carpet beneath her shoes muted her presence, but amplified the atmosphere around her. The luxury wing had a sound, and it wasn't noise, it was the absence of it. Hushed conversations, the click of Louboutins, the soft rustle of silk blouses, and the occasional tap of a card being handed over. Layla moved past a boutique known for its hand-woven bassinets. A sales associate inside turned at the sound of the elevator and immediately scanned her with clinical curiosity. Her gaze landed on the baby bag, paused, then slid to Layla's face as if waiting for her to misstep. Layla offered a small nod but didn't break stride. She wasn't here to prove a point, but she understood that her very existence in this space had already done so. She passed the perfume counter where 2 attendants were arranging bottles into neat pyramids. One of them, a tall brunette with heavy eye makeup and sharp red nails, muttered something under her breath just loud enough to be heard. Should probably try the outlet wing. Less pressure over there. The other laughed, short and breathy, and didn't look up. Layla heard it. She always heard it. It didn't hit like a slap. It hit like the soft, persistent erosion of identity, the kind that took pieces without leaving bruises. Further down the hallway, a white mother stood by the makeup display with her daughter, maybe 8 or 9 years old, bright-eyed and full of curiosity. Layla wasn't 2 steps past when the woman leaned down and whispered something. The girl glanced toward Layla's back and giggled, her small hand covering her mouth as if she'd been told a secret too funny to keep. Layla didn't turn around, but she could feel the heat behind her ribs, the way a person feels when they're not supposed to notice. She moved forward, spine rigid, steps careful, breath slow. She had learned the choreography of this place. Walk like you belong. Don't frown. Don't pause. Don't give them a reason to think they're right. At the high-end maternity boutique, her name was on the appointment list. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up as she took Layla's ID and scanned it. Her voice was clipped, rehearsed, a practiced form of civility that couldn't fully disguise her skepticism. The lounge was empty save for a glass table with imported water bottles, a bowl of dried fruit, and a sleek leather chair where Layla was directed to sit. She placed the gift box beside her, sat straight, crossed her ankles, and waited. The rep she was supposed to meet, Allison Pierce, was late. Layla glanced at her watch, then at the digital screen above the concierge desk that ticked through welcome messages for each private guest. Her name was not listed. A manager walked past the entry, glanced inside, and then doubled back. He entered the lounge, looked at Layla, and said the rep was running behind, but that he'd check again. She nodded politely. He left. She waited. She watched as another guest arrived, a younger blonde woman in leggings and a sports jacket. The front desk clerk smiled widely at her, addressed her by name before she even showed identification, then offered her water and led her directly into the showroom without pause. Layla sat still. After 10 more minutes, the rep finally arrived, flustered and apologetic, saying her calendar had been misaligned, that she hadn't realized the meeting was confirmed today. Layla accepted the explanation, though she knew it wasn't true. She had seen the automated email confirmations. She had seen how they treated others. She followed Allison into the showroom, where baby gear was arranged like art: white linen, lacquered wood, handmade mobiles, ergonomic carriers. Layla moved through it all with a practiced eye, responding to Allison's explanations with direct, intelligent questions. She wasn't here as a customer. She was here as a potential partner. But the tone never shifted. Allison explained things to her like she was a first-time mother browsing on instinct, not a businesswoman with a logistics team waiting for her feedback on material quality and distribution feasibility. The interaction ended with a promise to email specs, and Layla thanked her, knowing full well they would likely delay the follow-up or route it through a junior associate instead. As she left the boutique, she passed another pair of shoppers entering. They barely noticed her, but the clerk at the desk did. She leaned toward her colleague and whispered something Layla didn't catch, though she saw the glance, felt the stutter in posture, sensed the decision to keep talking once Layla was out of earshot. Back in the elevator, Layla checked her reflection in the polished steel. Her shoulders were straight. Her skin glowed under the halogen light. Her eyes were steady, focused. But something had shifted again. Another layer of silence thickening around her. Another reminder that money didn't buy belonging, that achievement didn't shield you from judgment, that they saw only what they wanted to see. Her presence continued to attract an invisible perimeter of attention, not because of how she looked, but because of what her presence disrupted. She represented a contradiction that some couldn't reconcile. Success draped in the skin they were taught to ignore, wealth carried in silence, power without apology. She paused near a bench outside a boutique that specialized in bespoke baby strollers. The corridor was quieter here, less traffic, more staff than customers. She set the gift box beside her and pulled out her phone to confirm the next meeting on her calendar, not noticing at first that 2 men in security uniforms had approached from opposite directions. One stopped in front of her, his posture firm, voice low but practiced. He asked her to accompany them for a brief review of surveillance footage due to a flag concern. When she calmly asked what concern, he answered vaguely, saying that it was related to a potential merchandise inconsistency reported moments earlier from the floor she had just visited. Layla, experienced in the language of deflection, understood that no one had accused her directly, not in words, but everything in the tone, in the suggestion, in the underlying implication pointed toward her. She stood slowly, asked where they were going, and followed without resistance. They led her not to a security office, but to a small conference room near the staff break corridor, sterile, undecorated, with a frosted glass door and a monitor mounted on the wall. One of the men left the room, allegedly to retrieve the footage in question, while the other remained inside, arms folded, back against the wall. Layla sat, legs crossed, fingers resting lightly on her phone. The monitor remained off. She asked again what the footage would show and was told that there had been a misalignment in item tracking from one of the boutiques and that routine checks were standard protocol. She knew it wasn't routine. She knew the timing wasn't coincidental. She also knew her silence at this moment wasn't about submission. It was about watching them stretch the line until it snapped. In a back hallway, behind the boutique, another employee, a junior floor assistant named Kyle, had been hovering near the security feed station. He had watched the brief interaction with curiosity. He had seen Layla enter the high-end maternity showroom earlier and had made a private comment to a co-worker about how rare it was to see someone like her in that environment. Now, seeing the security review unfolding, he felt emboldened. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo, not of Layla's face, but of the side of her baby bag as she sat calmly inside the security room. He then posted the image in a private staff group chat with a caption that read, trying to return luxury she probably never bought. Good luck explaining that bag. Several laughing reactions followed, along with comments layered in sarcasm and dog whistles disguised as jokes. None of them knew who she was. None of them expected to find out. To them, she was just another moment to share, to mock, to forget. Back in the room, Layla waited patiently as the guard returned, holding a flash drive. He connected it to the monitor and loaded the footage. What followed was a 5-minute clip of her walking through the boutique, examining products, standing beside the display shelves, speaking to the associate, and accepting the gift box. Everything lawful, everything documented. There was no confusion, no concealment, no moment where suspicion could logically arise. And yet the guard paused the video, rewound, and pointed at the moment she placed her bag briefly on a padded bench while speaking with the rep. He suggested that the motion could have obscured product visibility. Layla looked at him carefully, not surprised but disappointed by how desperately they clung to the illusion of due process. She asked if they had reviewed the security footage of any other guests who had lingered in that area. He didn't answer. He simply removed the flash drive, said the review had concluded, and thanked her for her cooperation. As she stepped back into the hallway, Layla noticed that the same employee who had been laughing earlier now stood at the end of the corridor, phone still in hand, gaze quickly darting away when their eyes met. She didn't acknowledge him, but she memorized his face. She also noticed the slight ripple in atmosphere as she re-entered the main corridor, the subtle silence that spread like a ripple in water. The image had already moved through channels. Staff on 3 different floors now knew what she looked like, knew her bag, knew the version of her they had created for entertainment. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't bothered to consider, was that their perception was built on a fantasy. She was no passerby. She was not a guest hoping to impress. She was not borrowing wealth. She was the origin of it. And they were about to learn that truth the hard way. She didn't go back to the cafe. She didn't revisit the boutique. She walked directly toward the central atrium and out through the front entrance, her posture unchanged, her pace steady, her silence unbroken. Not because they had won, but because the moment of consequence had begun. She unlocked her phone and opened her secure communications app. Her assistant had sent her a message. An internal alert had been triggered by a social media monitoring tool. The phrase used in the group chat had surfaced. The system flagged any mention of her company's signature product line or related trademarks in proximity to mocking language. She smiled slightly as she read the automated notification. Potential defamation cluster identified within staff communications thread at Ashfield Galleria. Evidence archived. She moved through the western corridor again, this time not with curiosity or reservation, but with a deliberate calm. Her phone remained in her coat pocket, still receiving pings from her internal alert system, flagging messages, recording timestamps, and monitoring staff chatter across connected networks. By the time she reached the executive service area near the luxury concierge, her arrival triggered a brief silence, the kind that falls not because people notice you, but because they remember you and don't yet know what to do with the discomfort you left behind. Layla stood beneath a chandelier shaped like a constellation, waiting for the floor manager she had been told would speak with her regarding the earlier misunderstanding. She wasn't told who it would be, only that it was someone of authority. 5 minutes passed before he appeared. He was tall, immaculately dressed in a slim-cut charcoal suit, and wore the kind of smile that had been trained in corporate workshops. His name tag read Assistant Director Byron Laveau, and the way he approached her made it clear he didn't see a customer. He saw a situation. He gestured politely toward a nearby consultation room, and Layla followed without resistance. The door closed behind them with a soft magnetic click, and the air inside was cooler, the walls a muted gray with a matte finish, no artwork, no branding, only stillness. Byron thanked her for returning, expressed appreciation for her cooperation, and began reviewing what he called the behavioral concern report filed earlier. According to the document in his hand, Layla had been the subject of repeated observations involving staff discomfort, customer unease, and what he described as visual misalignment with the tone of premium spaces. She asked calmly what that meant. and he replied that her appearance, behavior, and level of engagement had been flagged by multiple departments as inconsistent with their brand environment. She raised an eyebrow and asked if he meant to say she didn't look rich enough to belong. He smiled again, this time tighter, and said it was less about wealth and more about optics. His words were measured, deliberately ambiguous, but the implication was direct. Her presence, her skin, her style, her silence did not complement the fantasy they had curated for their VIP demographic. Byron then unfolded a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table toward her. It was a behavioral compliance form, typically used for guests involved in verbal altercations, shoplifting suspicions, or those displaying signs of intoxication. On it were phrases like acknowledgement of disruption, commitment to non-confrontational conduct, and agreement to avoid misrepresentation of identity. She scanned the form and noted the final line. Failure to sign will result in a temporary ban from all Ashfield Galleria properties, pending formal review. She looked at Byron and asked whether this was standard procedure for every guest whose coat didn't match the furniture. He said the decision had been escalated based on cumulative indicators and public feedback. She asked to see the feedback. He declined. She asked whether the ban applied immediately. He said no, but a refusal to sign would initiate the process. Outside the room, 2 security guards stood beside the decorative column, not in plain view, but close enough to react. One of them checked his watch. The other adjusted the strap of his vest. Inside, Layla leaned back in a chair and rested her hands flat on the glass tabletop. Her voice was calm as she asked Byron whether he believed the form in front of her would make the building more secure, whether her signature would somehow soothe the discomfort of those who had chosen to feel threatened by her presence. Byron didn't answer, at least not directly. Instead, he offered a practiced explanation about institutional standards and the right to protect brand reputation. Layla nodded slowly, reached into her coat, and pulled out her phone. She didn't speak again. She didn't raise her voice. She simply opened her calendar and canceled the next scheduled meeting, with the luxury baby brand occupying the flagship space 2 floors above. She made one more update to a different contract, one that would redirect their next campaign toward a different retail partner with more inclusive brand messaging. She finished her adjustments and stood up. Byron blinked and asked her to reconsider. She told him not to worry. She already had. She left the form and signed. She left the room without another glance at the security guards. She walked across the main atrium, past polished escalators and curated art installations, past floor managers pretending to focus on tablets as she passed. The building watched her leave, unaware that its foundation had already begun to crack. Across the country, her executive team had already received her notes. Contracts were being revised. Emails were being archived. Brand partners were being alerted. And deep in the server logs of Ashfield's own network, her legal team was downloading the entire transcript of staff conversations involving her name, her image, and the internal jokes they thought were private. Outside the building, the sky had shifted. The clouds had thickened into a pale slate gray, and a breeze cut through the parking lot with surgical chill. Layla opened the back seat of her car and placed the now symbolic gift box gently inside. She slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirror, and stared briefly at her own reflection. She had returned not to challenge, but to observe, to document, to ensure that every remaining thread of prejudice left uncovered would be revealed by its own arrogance. Her presence triggered a quiet chain reaction. A junior guard at the East Wing noticed her first, nudging the elbow of a coworker with a whispered look who just walked in. A floor manager near the jewelry hall glanced up from his tablet and immediately texted something short to the internal group chat. 2 security officers repositioned themselves casually near the central fountain, pretending to check the status of a maintenance update. Layla knew the choreography. They didn't expect confrontation. They expected withdrawal. But today, she came prepared for something else. Near the VIP entrance of the luxury infant brand, whose collaboration she had suspended, a digital display showed images of happy families, smiling mothers, curated serenity. Layla stood silently across from a screen, watching the images cycle one by one, none of which remotely resembled her. She knew exactly what that meant. Meanwhile, two teenage shoppers sat on the edge of a planter, scrolling through their phones, one of them nudging the other and pointing toward Layla. The second girl angled her camera and hit record, not maliciously, but out of the same instinct that captures celebrity, scandal, and spectacle. Within seconds, Layla's image appeared on her screen, still silent, composed. But the moment was disrupted when a third figure stepped into frame. A guard approached the girls and asked what they were recording. They hesitated. He repeated the question with more authority. One of them responded defensively, saying they were just filming the shopping haul. The guard insisted they stop, demanded to see the phone, and when questioned why, responded that the woman in their footage was a known disruptor. He said she had previously refused to cooperate with security and that it was in their best interest to delete the recording. His voice was firm, rehearsed, but not quite professional. It didn't sound like policy. It sounded like fear of exposure. The girls complied reluctantly, though one of them managed to send the clip to a friend before deleting it, a clip that would resurface online hours later with the caption, "She wasn't doing anything, just standing there. What are they afraid of?" As Layla moved away from the display and toward the central lounge, another incident was already unfolding across the atrium. A woman in her mid-40s with sharp features and a structured blazer stood by the concierge desk, voice raised just enough to carry. She had witnessed the interaction between Layla and security the day before and was now speaking directly to a new staff member, asking why someone like Layla had been treated that way. Her tone was firm, indignant, but measured. She mentioned bias, mentioned that she herself had walked through every store in that building without being questioned, and asked aloud what made Layla different. Before the staff member could respond, a supervisor stepped in, asked her to lower her voice, and when she refused, threatened to call mall security. The woman didn't back down. She raised her phone, began recording, and calmly stated that she was witnessing an attempt to silence a legitimate concern. Within minutes, two guards arrived and positioned themselves on either side of her. One of them placed a hand on his belt. The other asked if she wanted to be removed for disturbing the peace. The woman stood her ground, replying that peace was not the same as silence. That moment, too, would be captured on a nearby customer's phone, a father with his young daughter, who later posted the video with the caption, "Is this what accountability looks like now?" Back inside the management wing, Byron LaVue received a flurry of messages about escalating incidents. Staff chat channels lit up with nervous speculation. Someone suggested calling legal. Another asked whether public relations had been notified. Byron instructed one of the leads to identify anyone recording on site. He reminded them to monitor the situation, but avoid physical escalation unless necessary. That phrase, "unless necessary," would be repeated later in multiple incident reports, none of which would mention the original cause. An unarmed woman with a baby bag and an executive presence no one had recognized until it was too late. Layla, unaware of every whisper, but intuitively attuned to every shift in temperature, moved toward the central glass dome and stood beneath it as sunlight poured through. She had done nothing but exist in a place that hated to be reminded it wasn't truly inclusive. She had walked quietly, spoken politely, answered when questioned, waited when detained, and left without protest. But somehow, her very presence still threatened their structure. The way she walked was a challenge. The way she observed, even more so. She carried no anger on her face, only awareness. And that was enough to make the entire institution defensive. Outside, another clip surfaced. The group chat Kyle had posted in days earlier was leaked by a junior employee whose conscience had finally won over fear. Screenshots flooded Twitter, Reddit, and internal forums. The tone of the messages, the mockery, the assumptions, it was all there. Layla's name wasn't in them, but her image was. Her bag was. Her skin was the implication in every punchline. Comments ranged from disbelief to rage. Some asked how this still happened. Others warned that it would only get worse before it got better. But a few asked the only question that mattered. Who is she? And still, Layla Foster remained, not as a victim, not as a disruptor, but as a witness to the very mechanisms of injustice being triggered in real time. Every corridor she entered shifted. Every step she took reshaped the behaviors of those around her, not because she sought attention, but because the structure itself could no longer ignore the tension it created. Her presence, calm and unwavering, continued to unspool the carefully woven fabric of curated prejudice. As Layla sat in the lounge nearest the East Wing atrium, checking messages from her legal team, two uniformed guards approached again, this time without preamble, without apology, without even the performance of professionalism. One of them, the taller of the two, with a shaved head and pressed shoulders, spoke with a practiced edge that concealed the urgency of internal orders. He asked her to stand, informing her that she was being asked to leave the premises immediately. Layla, maintaining her composure, requested an explanation. The guard offered none. When she asked if there had been any violation, he replied that the mall had the right to remove individuals whose presence was deemed disruptive to the guest experience. She asked if there had been a formal complaint. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the exit. The second guard reached for the radio on his shoulder and mumbled a coded confirmation. Layla stood, smoothed her coat, and gathered her things. She didn't resist, didn't protest, didn't give them what they likely hoped for: emotion, confrontation, instability. She walked between the two men, head held high, while the eyes of dozens of onlookers followed her with varying expressions of confusion, discomfort, and recognition. Some whispered. Others took out their phones. Among them, near the third-level balcony, a mall employee named Bryce stood just outside the scent marketing kiosk, holding his phone upright, live streaming the entire scene. His caption read, "Another influencer meltdown in the rich zone." He smirked as the comments rolled in, laughing emojis, side remarks, assumptions from strangers who didn't know her name, didn't know the context, only saw a black woman escorted by guards and filled in the rest with their own bias. The camera panned as she passed beneath, showing only her from behind, accompanied by comments like "must have tried to shoplift" and "told you they fake it till they're caught." Layla didn't look up. She didn't need to. She had lived through more subtle versions of this moment her entire life. But this time, they had made the mistake of putting it on record. What Bryce didn't know, what no one in the crowd filming knew, was that one of the viewers of the live stream was a content moderator for a global platform who had previously collaborated with Layla's media team. Another was a university professor who had used Layla's company as a case study for economic empowerment in marginalized communities. A third was a former intern now managing a campaign for one of the very brands sold inside the Galleria. The video didn't just go viral. It hit the screens of people who knew exactly who Layla Foster was. Not just her company, not just her public image, but her legacy. One built on strategy, leadership, and silent power. As the guards led her past the concierge desk and out through the gold-trimmed revolving doors, a woman in her early 20s watched from behind the welcome counter. She had seen the internal emails earlier in the day. She had recognized the name that had been redacted in official reports, but visible in sender fields. Layla Foster, the woman they had tried to remove like an anonymous nuisance, was not just a customer. She was the executive force behind 3 major suppliers to the very stores they were protecting. And now she had been escorted out in full view of the public, without a single formal charge, without a violation, without even an accusation. Outside, the crowd didn't follow, but their curiosity lingered. One mother turned to her daughter and said that didn't look right. A young man checking his feed raised an eyebrow as the comments beneath the live stream started to shift. People began to ask real questions. Who is she? What did she do? Why didn't anyone say what rule she broke? Why did no one stop to verify anything? The tone shifted from mockery to confusion, then to doubt. In an office 20 minutes away, Layla's publicist received an alert from the crisis tracker. One mention had become thousands. The AI-based sentiment monitor flagged the post as likely to trend toward reputation risk. For the mall, not for Layla. The footage was now in the hands of her legal team, who had already downloaded the stream, gathered metadata, and prepared to link it to the earlier staff messages and the security footage from the incident 2 days before. Meanwhile, inside the Galleria's executive suite, Byron Lavu stood frozen in front of his office screen as the trending video loaded. His assistant had just burst in without knocking, waving a tablet. "Sir, I think this is going to get bad." Byron watched the feed replay. He saw the guards. He saw Layla. He recognized her posture, recognized the same quiet grace that had unnerved him in that consultation room. And he felt it, not guilt, not yet, but something colder. A calculation slipping out of his control. Layla reached her car, opened the door with slow, deliberate precision, and sat without rushing. Her phone buzzed. Her assistant's message was simple. Confirmed 2.7 million views for national accounts asking for statements. One investor wants to pull from Galleria expansion. She responded with a thumbs up, then another text. Contact Forbes. I'll give them the first official quote. Layla moved with unshaken posture across the plaza just outside the mall entrance, the heels of her boots clicking against the stone, each step carrying the same poise she held from the beginning. The difference now was that the storm was no longer around her. It was within her reach. She paused at the center of the marble path leading to the private valet entrance, and before she could even retrieve her car keys, a figure broke away from a waiting black SUV parked at the curb. The man mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit with subtle pinstripes and a navy silk tie, walked toward her with urgency but not panic. His eyes were focused, his expression serious. As he reached her, he slowed, straightened, and bowed his head slightly with professional deference. "Ms. Foster," he said, but then corrected himself immediately. "Excuse me, CEO Carter." The formality in his voice wasn't theatrical. It was a kind of tone used by people who understood hierarchy, who had seen power up close enough to know when they were standing before it. Around them, the sound seemed to suspend. A passing valet froze mid-step. A woman scrolling her phone looked up. Someone near the glass doors caught the name and blinked twice, trying to process the connection. Layla didn't pause. She nodded once and pulled her phone from the side pocket of her coat. Her fingers moved with precision, unlocking the screen and opening her private operations channel, a direct line only used for urgent corporate decisions. She didn't hesitate. Her voice was calm but absolute as she spoke into the receiver. "Is Rhonda online?" There was a pause, then confirmation. "Good. Effective immediately. Terminate all active promotional partnerships between Carter and Langston and the Ashfield Group retail complex. Yes, I want the order sent to compliance for signature and routed through legal. Add a clause for press coordination. If any brand under our control attempts to override this, withdraw the contract and freeze all payments. I want every dollar pulled by noon tomorrow." There was silence on the other end, followed by rapid agreement and movement. Layla ended the call, slid the phone back into her pocket, and looked once over her shoulder toward the mall's tall glass facade, its sleek reflection now fractured by the weight of what had just been decided. Inside, the reverberation had already begun. In the executive office, Byron Lavu stared at his screen as the first emergency alert popped into his inbox, a termination notice from Carter and Langston LLC, referencing multiple account closures, breach of partnership values, and formal withdrawal of financial engagement. The language was precise, cold, and lethal. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. In less than 10 minutes, 3 brand representatives who shared showroom space on the second floor received termination calls from their campaign managers. The partnership with Layla's company was considered foundational to their presence in the region. Without it, entire rollout plans would stall. PR teams began asking what had happened. Investors began dialing. Damage control meetings were called. Every one of them asked the same question: who approved the removal of the CEO? The man who had greeted Layla now stepped back respectfully, retrieved his phone, and made a separate call. His voice was soft but insistent. "It's done." She delivered the order herself. "They still don't know what's coming." Layla turned to her car, which had now been brought around by the valet. The driver opened the door slowly, his eyes wide, recognition flickering in his posture. I had no idea," he began, but Layla offered only a quiet nod, neither confirming nor correcting. She slid into the car and closed the door gently, not slamming it like someone hurt, not rushing like someone chased. Her presence remained composed, silent, lethal. The SUV she passed on her way in now followed her as an escort, carrying members of her strategic advisory team who had been briefed an hour earlier when the first viral video crossed their analytics dashboard. They had seen this pattern before. They had prepared for it. But this time, Layla hadn't waited for a boardroom debrief. She had acted, not with press statements or carefully scripted interviews, but with immediate financial severance. She had turned silence into leverage, and the market would feel it before the sun went down. As her car pulled out of the Ashfield complex, cameras still caught her from behind. Some viewers online still speculated. Others now scrambled to apologize in comments under earlier posts. Influencers began deleting their snide reactions, replacing them with long captions about learning and listening. Brands began revising scheduled posts, quietly pulling their tags from Ashfield accounts. A news anchor paused during a scheduled report to say, "We're just receiving breaking confirmation that the woman escorted from Ashfield Galleria earlier today is in fact Layla Carter, co-founder and CEO of Carter & Langston, a privately held conglomerate valued at over $900 million, with retail interests in family health, infant wellness, and sustainable luxury products." Her removal now appears to have major financial consequences for the mall group. In the clips, Layla could be seen entering boutiques, interacting politely, never raising her voice, never violating any code, never once engaging in the misconduct that had been implied by mall staff and security. Instead, the footage revealed a pattern. Each staff member's condescending tone, each visual tailing by guards, the unmistakable body language of surveillance, cloaked in feigned hospitality, and ultimately, the moment she was surrounded by security and asked to leave without justification. One clip in particular began to circulate more rapidly than the rest, a silent recording from the executive lounge entry camera. In it, Byron Lavu could be seen handing her a behavior contract, while she calmly declined and left the paper unsigned. The frame that froze everyone was the moment her phone call began. Clear audio, thanks to overhead mics, captured her unmistakable command, effective immediately. Terminate all active promotional partnerships between Carter and Langston and the Ashfield Group retail complex. Within hours, hashtags exploded across social platforms. Hashtag She Owns the Brands began trending. Then came the cascade of investigative reporting. Financial correspondents, tech outlets, business news anchors, all confirmed what some had suspected and many had doubted. Layla Carter, the woman profiled and removed from Ashfield without cause, was a founder and primary shareholder of Carter & Langston, a privately held enterprise operating across maternal wellness, sustainable baby care, organic infant nutrition, and postpartum care services across 5 continents. 6 of Ashfield's top-performing stores had active supply agreements with her company. 3 of those brands, Nestoria Kids, Bloompost, and Maribel Essentials, were stocked floor-to-ceiling with her products. Combined, those partnerships made up nearly 30% of the mall's annual retail floor value. One news segment showed a graph that stunned even the casual viewer. A single pivot in her investment portfolio meant millions in lost revenue for the Galleria's Q4 forecast. The figure most quoted was staggering: $900 million in corporate reach, much of it funneling through consumer channels that had for years depended on Layla's supply chain. The news was relentless. Major outlets began airing commentary segments with titles like "The Cost of Assumptions" and "When the Boss Isn't Recognized." Within 24 hours, broadcast interviews began airing previously unaired footage from her TED Talk appearances, startup accelerator panels, and business conferences where she had spoken as a keynote about race, resilience, and responsibility in retail economics. Screens everywhere now showed a different version of the woman once escorted out, this time on stage in front of venture capitalists and policy leaders, breaking down the profit margins of baby formula innovation or leading workshops on ethical manufacturing standards. By midday, a profile ran on a leading financial magazine titled "The Quiet Power of Layla Carter," featuring quotes from former employees, competitors, and global CEOs who had all, at one point, underestimated her until they couldn't. Meanwhile, back at Ashfield, Chaos unraveled behind closed boardroom doors. Executives scrambled to control the narrative. Legal consultants were flown in. Crisis managers demanded time to craft a response, but the public had already rendered its verdict. Consumers began canceling subscriptions, uninstalling store apps, flooding review pages with one-star protests. One viral tweet simply read, "She built your shelves. You shoved her out the door. We see you now." Local influencers, who had once received promotional gifts from the very stores involved, began posting apology videos. Some brands tried to distance themselves, issuing bland statements about learning and growth. Others panicked, reached out directly to Carter and Langston's corporate office, asking to renegotiate, to clarify their loyalty, to beg, discreetly, not to be included in the fallout. Inside the mall, foot traffic dropped by 27% in 2 days. A promotional campaign scheduled for weekend launch was pulled. Digital screens went dark. And most notably, the concierge counter that once denied her presence now featured a nervous new face, hastily trained to deflect questions from the press camped just outside. One image, captured by a journalist on the third day, became iconic. Layla Carter's face on a front page, held up beside the photo of her being let out in silence. The caption read, "From target to tactician." It wasn't just news. It was vindication. In her office, high above the city skyline, Layla watched each development without flinching. She didn't speak publicly, not yet. Her team handled the flood of requests, the sudden rush of speaking invitations, the corporate damage control offers from Ashfield Board. Her silence was strategic. Her silence was weight. In private, she reviewed a final document, a clause buried in her partnership contract with Ashfield that would allow her to trigger a breach of values clause, forcing a reassessment of every vendor connected to her brand. She signed the form and handed it to her chief compliance officer with a single sentence: "Activate every clause." They wrote the rules. We'll show them how they work. The clause required them to review, reassess, and if necessary, terminate any agreements with a host institution found in violation of ethical treatment standards. None of them hesitated. Within hours, withdrawal letters began piling up at the Galleria's legal office, each more decisive than the last, referencing public footage, reputational risk, and contractual obligation to sever ties. On the same afternoon, a joint press release was issued from Layla's public relations agency and the general counsels of the 6 brands, stating they were immediately suspending all commerce within the Ashfield complex, citing a breach of ethical commercial alignment and irreversible damage to brand trust. The financial fallout came fast. By nightfall, Ashfield's parent company saw a 5-point dip in market value. By morning, it became 13. Investors began calling for emergency board meetings. The real estate trust backing the expansion of the mall's northern wing pulled funding before noon. One global fund publicly announced a reevaluation of all retail-related assets tied to Ashfield Holdings. Consumer forums lit up with screenshots of Layla's name alongside graphics titled Ashfield Exposure, mapping out how deeply her influence had run across departments. Internal staff rosters scrubbed quickly the night before, in a hasty attempt to isolate accountability, leaked nonetheless. In one file, names of guards, supervisors, concierge managers, and executive assistants were listed alongside timestamps of decision points, from the first stop and search to the moment Layla was removed from the premises. Public pressure turned personal. People began demanding names, accountability, action. The Ashfield Executive Board convened under duress for a crisis session that lasted 9 hours. Legal advisors urged them to issue a public statement and sever anyone involved directly in the incident. In less than 24 hours, 7 terminations were confirmed and executed. The head of security, whose signature had approved the escort order against Layla, was released from duty. 2 mid-level shift managers who had failed to de-escalate the situation were removed without severance. Byron Lavu, who had personally handed Layla the behavior contract and made no effort to verify her credentials, was formally dismissed from his position as assistant director, a memo citing gross misjudgment resulting in reputational harm. News of the firings spread faster than the original incident. Headlines read, "Ashfield cleans house" and "Executive bloodletting after profiling scandal." But the public didn't view it as cleanup. They saw it as consequence. Protesters began to gather at the main entrances of the mall, not in overwhelming numbers, but with enough presence to become symbolically powerful. A local university's student-led business ethics group held signs quoting Layla's words, "Access isn't inclusion." Activists organized coordinated boycotts, urging shoppers to reconsider their holiday purchases and support retailers with inclusive governance. Retailers not affiliated with Layla's companies now felt the tremor. Some released statements to show support for her leadership. Others issued carefully worded defenses of neutrality, but none could escape the vacuum that her exit had created. Financial analysts began publishing predictions on Ashfield's Q4 collapse, suggesting a minimum 37% decrease in total revenue. Social media amplified everything. Posts with side-by-side comparisons of Ashfield storefronts, once bustling, now eerily sparse, circulated widely. TikTok creators made breakdown videos explaining how Layla had not just exposed racism, but exercised a level of corporate precision that rivaled high-stakes boardroom plays. Inside Ashfield's remaining offices, surviving staff moved with visible anxiety. HR departments struggled to manage interviews, legal notices, and employee concerns simultaneously. Morale plummeted. Anonymous internal surveys leaked showing 78% of staff no longer felt confident in the leadership's ethics or direction. Customer service lines were overwhelmed with calls, not about product inquiries, but complaints regarding the incident. Some asked if Layla would return. Others asked if the mall had changed policies. Most simply expressed disgust and closed their accounts. Eventually, the Ashfield board was forced to confront the only path left: public admission. A press conference was scheduled, set to take place in the west atrium of the Galleria, with sleek banners that had once showcased seasonal promotions, now hastily replaced with Ashfield's logo under a banner reading, "Our Responsibility." News crews gathered. The public tuned in. Cameras rolled. The spokesperson stepped to the podium, an unfamiliar executive from the legal team rather than any former face of authority. The address began with formality, moved into acknowledgement, and then into a rehearsed apology. The statement admitted that an incident had occurred, that internal reviews confirmed inappropriate conduct, that Layla Carter had been treated unfairly, and that her removal had not followed standard protocol. The executive paused before reading the final prepared sentence. "We failed to uphold the standards we claim to represent, and for that we apologize, not just to MS Carter, but to every guest who no longer feels welcome under our roof." The apology went live. Clips of it spread rapidly, but the reactions remained divided. Some saw it as the first step toward accountability. Others called it too late, too polished, too reactive. Layla herself did not respond publicly. Her team issued a brief statement. "We acknowledge Ashfield's response and remain focused on ensuring systemic accountability, not just statements." She had moved on to meetings with government partners and nonprofit leaders about implementing a nationwide training framework on anti-bias practices in commercial spaces. Her voice, once silenced by assumption, now echoed through boardrooms, universities, and headlines. In the weeks following the public reckoning at Ashfield Galleria, a silence fell over the city, not the kind born from apathy, but one crafted from reflection. The noise had peaked, the headlines had cooled, and the frenzy of corporate response had transitioned into quieter efforts of internal review and policy reform. But for those at the center of the storm, particularly the ones who once stood in judgment, the aftermath did not come with comfort. For them, it came with long, sleepless nights, replayed footage, unread messages, and the heavy realization that their moment of casual cruelty had collided with someone else's entire legacy. Some left the retail world entirely. Others drifted into quieter roles, choosing obscurity over confrontation. But a few, driven not by guilt alone, but by the deeper hunger to understand and correct, chose another path. One that led them directly back to the very woman they once dismissed. One morning, at the downtown headquarters of Carter and Langston, A security guard named Thomas Rudd, once the oldest and most senior staff member at Ashfield's enforcement team, stood at the front desk of the reception floor. He wore no uniform now, only a gray cardigan and a weathered expression, the kind shaped by decades of labor and a heart recently fractured by truth. He requested a meeting, not with an assistant, not with a lawyer, but with Layla herself. He didn't ask for compensation, didn't bring a resume. He brought an envelope with a handwritten note. In it, he admitted to his failure, not in enforcing protocol, but in not questioning it when it felt wrong. He wrote about the way he watched her stand tall even as the others sought to shrink her, about how his silence had joined the harm, and about how he could no longer carry that with him unless he did something to repay it. Layla, upon receiving the note, sat with it for 10 minutes before replying. She asked her outreach director to offer Thomas a volunteer position with their youth advocacy initiative, specifically in a program designed to re-educate retail security personnel on bias awareness and de-escalation through empathy. Thomas accepted with both hands and a bowed head. Weeks later, he stood in front of a classroom of trainees, recounting his experience, not as a warning, but as a confession. "I thought I knew my job," he told them, "until the day I realized I had guarded the wrong values." Elsewhere, another transformation unfolded under brighter lights. At a TEDx event hosted in a restored library auditorium funded by Carter and Langston's Community Literacy Initiative, a young woman named Brielle Simmons stood nervously behind a lectern. She had once worked at Ashfield's concierge desk. She had once whispered jokes. She had once sent a message mocking a bag she didn't understand. And she had once watched, frozen, as the woman she ridiculed was removed without a word. Now, under the soft spotlight, Brielle took a breath and spoke into the silence. She told her story. She did not hide the details. She named her role. She described the toxic atmosphere that normalized mockery, the complicity that wore the mask of professionalism, and the hollow feeling that consumed her when the truth came out. But she also spoke of change, not the kind that comes through press releases, but the kind that arrives in fragments, in the form of late-night realizations, quiet tears, and the courage to ask for help. Layla had not reached out to Brielle. Brielle had reached out to her. She had sent an email weeks after the incident, apologizing, not with excuses, but with questions. "How do I make this right? Where do I begin?" Layla had not responded immediately. Instead, she had forwarded the message to the educational team overseeing their new empathy training modules and said, "Give her a seat. Let's see who she becomes." What Brielle became was not just a speaker, but an advocate, someone who used her mistake as a mirror for others who still hid behind systems of denial. As the auditorium applauded, Layla watched from backstage, unseen but present. She didn't need the credit. Her legacy wasn't built from validation. It was forged through resilience and sealed by action. Later that night, she walked alone through the quiet hallway outside the venue, past murals painted by children from the inner-city school her foundation had adopted. The mural nearest the exit featured a simple drawing: a dark-skinned girl in a suit, holding hands with a smaller child beneath a sign that read, "You belong here." Layla stopped and smiled, touched her fingers briefly to the image, and walked outside into the evening. Above her, the city skyline glowed. Headlines had faded. Hashtags had disappeared. But the story had not ended. It had simply evolved from injustice to consequence, from consequence to reform, and from reform to healing. The people who once participated in her erasure had now become instruments of awareness. The ones who watched and said nothing had found their voices. And the systems that had stood on outdated hierarchies now faced new standards written not in protest, but in policy. Across the country, other malls, stores, and corporate chains began reviewing their own practices. Several even adopted frameworks modeled on Carter and Langston's post-incident ethics curriculum. Legislation inspired by Layla's ordeal was proposed by a state senator in a neighboring district, seeking to mandate transparency training and equity audits for all commercial institutions receiving public tax breaks. At home, Layla sat in her study, surrounded by reports, media plans, and curriculum drafts. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Thomas. It read, "First day with the new recruits. They asked me what changed. I said, I finally met the owner instead of assuming the customer." She replied simply, "Keep going." She then opened a folder titled Future Leads and added 2 names, Thomas Rudd and Brielle Simmons. Above their names, she wrote one word, potential. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moment hit you the hardest? Which twist took you by surprise? Let us know in the comments below, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters in stories like these.